coach from Miles City came into Cedar Bend an hour past noon on a cold October day in 1884, and the only passenger to step down onto the frozen ruts of the street was a small woman in a black dress with one carpetbag and gloves that had been mended so many times the mending had its own mending. Her name was Opal Sackett, and she was 34 years old, and she had been a widow for 2 years, and everything she owned in the world was in that one bag, except the things she carried where nobody could see them. The man waiting by the buckboard was tall and worn thin, the way a fence rail gets worn where the cattle lean on it year after year. He had a week of beard on his jaw and a letter in his hand, and he looked at the letter, and then at her, and then at the letter again, as if the two did not add up to the same sum. "You'd be the Sackett woman," he said. "I would. Josiah Ashford." He did not offer his hand. He looked her over the way a man looks over a fence post he is not sure about, from her worn boots to the grey coming in at her temples, and what he saw plainly did not reassure him. "You're smaller than I figured for kitchen work. The advertisement said 7 children. That wasn't a misprint." "I read it twice to be sure," Opal said. "The oldest is 17. The youngest is 4. There's washing and cooking and mending and schooling to see to, and I'll say it plain so there's no confusion later. You're hired to mind the young ones and keep the house. Nothing more and nothing less. The ranch work is ranch work, and it's no place for a woman." Opal looked at him for a moment, and then she picked up her own bag before he could decide whether to reach for it, and she said, "Then I expect we understand each other, Mr. Ashford." He grunted, which she would come to learn was the greater part of his conversation, and he helped her up onto the buckboard seat, and they rolled out of Cedar Bend toward the mountains, with the wind coming down off the high country smelling of snow that had not fallen yet. The Lazy H sat in a bend of Harlan Creek 8 miles from town, and Opal read the place the whole last mile the way another woman might have read a letter. The gate hung on one hinge, the garden had gone to frost-killed weeds, and she did not need to see much more. A ranch tells you everything if you know how to listen, and this one said grief, said a man doing the work of 3 and failing at the work of 1, said children raising children. It said a house running on stubbornness, and not much else. And then she saw the horse. He was in the far corral, a grey stallion the colour of wood smoke on a winter morning, with a head that belonged on a coin, and he was pacing the fence line in long-reaching strides, around and around, wearing a track in the frozen ground. And even at a 1/4 mile, Opal felt something turn over in her chest that she had kept locked down for 2 years, something she had buried in a grave in Wyoming beside a man named Opal Sackett and sworn she would never dig up again. "That's a fine animal," she said, before she could stop herself. "That's a killer," Josiah said, and his voice shut like a door. "Don't go near that corral. I mean that as much as anything I'll ever say to you." The children were lined up on the porch when the buckboard rattled into the yard. 7 of them stair-stepped, and Opal took them in one at a time. A boy of about 13 with horse-hungry eyes, that would be Toby. Then a shuffling run of middle ones, twins of 10, a boy of 8, a girl of 6, elbowing one another on the cold boards. Then the smallest, 4 years old and barefoot, a rag doll hanging by one arm, and that was Wren, wearing her dead mother's fair hair. And at the end of the line, arms crossed, chin up, stood a girl of 17 with flour on her sleeves and a look on her face that Opal recognized from the inside, because she had worn it herself once a long time ago, standing on another porch in another territory. It was the look of a girl who had been the woman of a house since before she was done being a child, and who understood exactly what a stranger stepping off a buckboard might mean, and who had already decided to hate her for it. "This is Nell," Josiah said. "She'll show you the kitchen." "I keep the kitchen fine," Nell said, to nobody in particular, to the mountains, to the wind. "She'll show you the kitchen," Josiah said again, tired, and went to unhitch the team. The kitchen told the same story the yard had told. A cook stove with a cracked lid nobody had blacked in a year, a flour barrel down to siftings, and the rest of the shelves to match. Nell walked her through it in 11 words and left her standing there, and Opal did not touch a thing that first hour. She only stood and looked, the way she had been taught to stand and look at a corral full of green colts, taking her silent inventory, seeing not what was there but what was needed. Then she tied on her apron and built up the fire. There was a man in the bunkhouse doorway watching her cross the yard at dusk when she went out for stovewood, an old wrangler with a white moustache stained amber at the corners, and 2 fingers on his left hand that did not bend any more. He came over slow, the way old cowboys walk when the weather is turning, and he stood between her and the woodpile, which put him, not by accident, between her and the far corral. "Name's Gus Pell. I'm foreman here, what there is to be foreman of." He said it civil enough, but there was a warning under it like a rock under thin water. "I'll tell you what I tell everybody. That grey stud yonder is bred in the purple and crazy as a burnt cat. 12 men have forked him or tried. 12. 2 of them left this place in a wagon lying down. He put my own self over that fence last spring, and I've broke rough stock since before your pa was shaving. And I'm telling you, some horses just come wrong out of the mare. Kitchen and nursery, missus. That's your country. The corral is mine." "I heard the same from Mr. Ashford," Opal said. "Then you heard it twice, and twice ought to hold." He touched his hat brim and stumped away. Opal stood with her arms full of split pine and watched the grey pace out the last light. She watched the way he moved and the way his ears worked toward every sound in the yard, and she read him the way she could not help reading any horse alive, the way Cole had taught her and his father had taught him, 3 generations of Sacketts who could talk to anything with hooves. And what she read did not say killer. It said sound. It said afraid. It said somebody has done something to this horse, and he is guarding himself the only way a horse knows how. She stood there until her arms ached with the cold, saying nothing, the way she had gotten good at saying nothing. Supper that night was beans and fried mush, and the children ate fast and quiet with their elbows guarding their plates, the way children eat when there has not quite been enough for a long time, and that told Opal more than a month of talk. Little Wren would not settle afterward, fretting and whining at Nell's skirts while Nell tried to wash dishes and mind the 6-year-old and be 17 all at the same time. And finally Opal simply sat down in the rocker by the stove and began to hum, low, an old Wyoming trail song, not looking at anybody, her hands busy with mending she had found in a basket. It is the same with children as with colts. You do not walk at them. You make yourself quiet and easy in the middle of the room, and you let them decide. By full dark, Wren was asleep against her shoulder, with the rag doll clutched under her chin, and Josiah, coming in from the barn, stopped in the doorway and looked at the two of them a long moment, and for the space of a breath he was seeing another woman in that rocker, Della, his wife, 2 autumns in the ground, and then he was not seeing her, and he said nothing, and went to bed. Through the window over the dry sink, out past the yard, the grey stallion paced his fence line under the rising moon, around and around, like a watch nobody could wind down. Opal was up before 4 the next morning. She had the stove hot and the coffee on and a sponge of biscuit dough working before the first child stirred, and she had the day's chores parcelled out in her head, and by the time grey light came up over the mountains the house was warm and full of the smell of baking, which is a thing a grieving house forgets. It has been missing until it comes back. Then, with the children fed and the little ones set to lessons at the table, and an hour bought and paid for, she put on her coat and took a coffee can of oats and a coil of soft rope from the barn, and she walked out to the far corral through the frost and she went to work. She did not climb in. She was not a fool, and she had buried a husband, and she knew better than anyone living what a wrong horse can do. She stood outside the poles at the corner, where the wind would carry her smell to him, and she let him run his circles, and she talked. Not words that mattered. The sound was what mattered, low and level and endless, the sound of a human being who wanted nothing and was in no hurry, which was a sound she judged this horse had not heard in a long while. He blew and snorted and quartered past her with his eye rolling white, and she kept talking. He stopped across the corral with his hindquarters to her, which is a horse's way of insulting you, and she kept talking. The frost burned off. Her feet went numb in her boots. And along toward the end of the hour the grey stallion came shifting and sidling down the fence, a foot at a time, pretending the whole way that he was not doing what he was plainly doing, until his nostrils were working the air a yard from her shoulder, and Opal Sackett laid her palm flat on the top rail with a little pile of oats on it, and looked away from him at the mountains, because you never look a scared thing in the eye when it is deciding, and she felt his whiskers, and then his warm breath, and then the soft velvet push of his muzzle against her hand. Craft, not magic. 10,000 patient hours, hers and Cole's, and old Amos Sackett's before them, standing at cold fences learning the one language horses speak, but her eyes stung anyway, and it was not the wind, and she stood there letting a killer stallion eat oats off her palm, and grieved her husband properly for the first time in 2 years. He let you touch him. She turned, unhurried, because hurrying is the last thing you do around a green horse or a startled boy. Toby stood 10 feet back with a feed bucket hanging forgotten from his hand and his mouth open, and behind his shock his eyes were shining like a man who has seen the elephant. 12 men, the boy whispered. He put Ferris in a wagon. He let you touch him. He did. How? Ma'am, how? By not being in a hurry. She came away from the fence and stood in front of him and studied his face, and what she found there she liked. It was horse hunger, pure and old, the same thing she had carried at his age. Toby, I'm going to ask something of you, and I'll trade for it square. Keep this quiet a while, what you saw. There's reasons, and they're good ones, and when the time's right, I'll teach you a piece of what I know. But a thing spoken too soon spoils, like milk in thunder. Can you hold it? He looked at her, and looked at the grey, and something passed between the three of them in the cold morning that was very like a contract being signed. Yes, ma'am, Toby said. I can hold it. But a horse cannot keep a secret, and that was where the trouble started. Because Gus Pell had been reading that Stallion all summer the way a man reads bad weather, and that same evening he stood at the fence with his ruined hand hooked over the top pole and watched the grey stand quiet in the corner, flat-footed, resting a hip, watching the house. Not pacing, not wearing his track, just watching the house with his ears up soft, and Gus took that in for a long while, and then he turned around and looked at the house too, and at the small woman moving past the lamplit kitchen window, and his eyes narrowed down to leather. I had that horse figured, he said to her next morning, catching her at the well. Not accusing, worse than accusing, thinking. Figured him clean down to the ground. Crazy, I had him figured. And now he stands in that corner of an evening gentle as a plough mule, and the only thing changed on this outfit is you. He hoisted the bucket for her, which he had not done before, and set it on the coping, and looked at her from under his hat brim. Kitchen and nursery, missus. I'll say it the once more, kindly. Stay off my corral. You've said it, Opal agreed, and carried her water in, and he stood watching her go with his jaw working like he was chewing on a thought too big for his teeth. Now, friend, if this story is finding its way into your heart, the way that Gray found his way to Opal's hand, stay with me, because everything this woman buried is about to be called up out of the ground, and I would not want you to miss the day it happens. And if you have ever known a woman like her, one the world sized up small and sized up wrong, tell me about her in the comments, because stories like hers are the reason we light this lamp. Roland Draper came to the Lazy H on the first Saturday in November, riding a blood bay gelding worth more than the Ashford house, wearing grey kid gloves, and trailing behind him a big, slope-shouldered man named Loomis, with a way of not looking at anything that made Opal look at him twice. Draper was the money in that country. He lent on land and lent on cattle and lent on desperation, and he smiled all the time, and the smile never once got as far as his eyes. Josiah, he did not get down, which said everything about how he ranked the man he was talking to. He drew a folded paper from inside his coat and held it up like a man holding up a hand of cards he has already won with. Court day is the 17th. I'll want the note settled in full, principal and interest, per the terms. Josiah went very still in the middle of his own yard. The terms was spring, Roland. We shook on spring shipping season. You know it, and I know it. The paper says the 17th of November. Draper's voice was mild as skim milk. Now, I take no pleasure in this, but paper is paper, and the law reads what is written, not what is remembered. His eyes went slow around the place, pricing it, the house, the barn, the children on the porch, pricing all of it, and they came to rest on the far corral, and something flickered in them, quick as a fish, and was gone. Of course, there's not $800 of stock on this place fit to drive to market, that grey outlaw least of all. A man-killer is worth his hide and hooves, and not a nickel over, blood or no blood, and I know horseflesh, Josiah, none better. So I'll say this once, as a neighbour. Deed the place to me quiet before court day, the whole of it, stock included, and I'll tear the note up and let you take the wagon and go with your debts paid and your name clean. That's mercy, and it's more than the law will show you on the 17th. He touched his hat to no one in particular, and turned the bay, and Loomis turned with him, and as they went, Opal watched the big man's eyes drag once slow across the far corral, the way a man checks on work he has left half done. That was the day the clock started ticking in the house, tick along under everything, under the biscuits and the lessons and the mending. 16 days, 15, 14. In town at the Mercantile Opal heard the talk over the dry goods, Mrs. T clucking to the postmaster's wife, that poor Ashford outfit, mortgaged past saving. And did you see the little widow woman he hired? Why, she won't winter. That place would break a big woman, and she is not one, mark me. Come spring, she'll be on the eastbound coach. Opal bought her thread and said her good mornings, and let them have their verdict. She had been sized up small in 14 towns in 3 territories. It had long since stopped bleeding. But Nell heard the talk too, standing by the window with the sugar sack in her arms, and Nell carried it home the way girls carry such things, down deep where it turns to fear. That night Opal came quiet down the hall, and through the gap of the door she saw the eldest sitting on the edge of the bed she shared with the little girls, holding Wren by both shoulders, and heard her say, low and fierce, "Don't you go loving her, Wren, do you hear me? She's kitchen help is all, hired kitchen help, and hired help leaves. They always leave, or they—" And Nell's voice caught on the thing she could not say, on a grave up the hill under a wind-bent pine. "They go, so don't you go loving her." And Opal stood in the dark hall with her candle, and did not go in, because there is nothing you can say to that, nothing in words. The girl was not being cruel. The girl was building the only fence she knew how to build around the only stock she had left to protect. Opal understood fences. She went back down the hall and lay in her narrow bed, and stared at the ceiling a long time. It was Wren who broke the quiet of that same deep night, padding barefoot into Opal's little room off the kitchen with her doll dragging, whimpering about a dream, and Opal lifted her into the warm and wrapped the quilt around them both, and stood rocking her at the window, humming the trail song, watching the great cold field of stars over the mountains. And it was because she was standing at that window, at that black hour, with a child breathing against her neck, that she saw it. A shadow came off the creek willows and crossed the lower yard, big, slope-shouldered, moving the way a man moves when he has done a thing so many times he no longer bothers to be careful. And it went to the far corral, to the grey, and the grey woke into his frenzy, and the shadow was in the poles of the chute doing something, close and deliberate, something with its hands at the horse's head while the animal fought the snub. And then it was gone back into the willows, and the stallion was left screaming and circling under the stars, mad as they all said he was. Opal stood at the window with her heart going slow and hard, the way it used to go before she rode into a bad corral. Loomis, Draper's man, on Draper's errand. And 12 men could not break that horse, she thought. Well, no, 12 men could not break what one man kept breaking. She looked down at Wren asleep in her arms, and up at the far dark corral, and everything she had buried in Wyoming came up out of the ground all at once, quiet and complete, and put itself back on like a well-worn glove. She laid the child in her own warm bed. Then she dressed in the dark, and took Cole's coiled rawhide riata down out of her carpetbag, where it had lain wrapped in oilcloth for 2 years, and went out into the night. She did not go to the corral. She went to the willows, and she found what she knew she would find, because a trail tells you everything if you know how to listen, and Opal Sackett had been raised to listen, a worn path along the creek, coming from Draper's line camp 2 miles east. Boot prints, big, pigeon-toed days and days of them, a trampled place at the corral chute, and in the frost-stiff grass where a careless hand had dropped it, a small brown bottle, uncorked, smelling of something bitter and vegetable that made her nose wrinkle and her blood go cold. She had seen sale barn men use such stuff in reverse, dosing outlaw horses quiet to sell them gentle. This was the same coin flipped over. Dose a good horse wild, gouge him under the jaw where the halter hides it, spook him with the bottle smell he has learned to dread, keep the wound in him open week on week, and you have built yourself a man-killer that no one will bid on, out of a stallion worth a fortune. Because that was the other thing. She had gone through the tack room a week back for harness leather, and in a tin box she had found the stallion's papers, come west with the grey out of the wreck of Della's father's estate, the last blooded thing her people had left her, the one thing Josiah had never had the heart to sell even after the horse turned outlaw, and she had read them by candle. The grey was got by Meridian, that had taken the short horse purses at Denver 3 years running. There was not a stockman between the rivers who would not empty his bank for a sound son of Meridian. Draper knew. Draper had known all along. The note, the sabotage, the mercy offer, it was all one machine with one product, and the product was that horse. The next night, she was waiting in the willows when Loomis came down the path. She took him the way she and Cole had taken wild stock out of the cedar brakes, which is to say, she let him walk past her in the dark, and put the riata on him from behind, underhand, no whirl to warn him, and snubbed it to a willow trunk before he understood what had him, and when he lunged, she dallied and let the tree do the arguing. He was twice her size. It did not matter, and that too was craft. A rope does not care who throws it. "You'll hang for this," he wheezed when he had stopped fighting. "Nobody hangs for roping a trespasser at his work," Opal said. She stood where he could see her, small in the starlight, and she held up the brown bottle, and she watched his face fall open. "Puccoon and hellebore, I'd judge, or something near it. You've been dosing that stud and gouging him under the jawline since the ice went out in the spring, on Roland Draper's dollar, to keep him outlaw till the foreclosure. And here's what you'll want to think on, Mr. Loomis, and think fast, because the cold's coming up. The man who pays for a crime and the man who does it don't ride the same distance when the law starts asking. Draper will be sitting warm in the courtroom in his grey gloves, swearing he never met you. You'll want a friend before the 17th. I'm the only one out here offering." It took a while, there in the dark and the cold, but roping a man's body is a small thing next to roping his fear, and she had his fear dallied tight. He told it all, in a voice gone flat as ditch water. The dosing, the gouging, the wage paid in gold coin behind the livery. And the other thing, the thing she had only suspected, that he had stood in the back room of Draper's office in August, and watched the man copy Josiah Ashford's note over fresh in his own neat hand, spring shipping season rewritten into the 17th of November, and burn the true paper in the stove, and that the fresh paper had come out of a crate of Chicago stationery Loomis himself had freighted up from the railhead in June, 2 full months after the true note was signed and shook on, with the Mills mark printed small in the corner of every sheet. Opal rode into Cedar Bend that same night on the Ashfords' old bay saddle mare, through the cold under the wheeling stars, 8 miles in the dark, with Loomis walking ahead of her at the end of the riata, and she was waiting on the step of the sheriff's office when he came to unlock it in the morning, a small woman in a black dress with a brown bottle in one pocket, and Roland Draper's foreman on 50 feet of raw hide. Loomis told it all over again in the sheriff's back room, sworn and signed before witnesses, and was left sitting in the one cell Cedar Bend owned, held quiet on the trespass, where he could warn nobody, and if Draper wondered in the days after where his man had drifted to, he was not the kind to go asking the law. By the time Opal rode home, the frost had burned off the fences, and there were 4 days left on the clock. Court day came in on a north wind. Half the county was in Cedar Bend for it, wagons parked hub to hub, because foreclosures were meat and drink to a hungry town, and behind the livery stood the Lazy H stock, hauled in the day before at Draper's own order for the court's appraisal, the grey alone in the stoutest pen with the town boys daring one another along his rails. Draper had a crowd to play to and played to it, standing before the judge's table in the packed hall with the note held high. Josiah stood across from him in his good Sunday coat, brushed for the occasion, holding his hat in both hands, with Nell and the children in a stiff row behind him, and he looked like what he was, an honest man watching the machinery close on him, and the crowd murmured its pity, which is the cheapest coin there is. "The paper is plain," Draper was saying, "and I have offered this man more mercy than paper requires. The place will not bring the debt at auction, Your Honour. That is the sorrow of it. Broke-down improvements, culled over stock, and the one animal of any blood on the outfit a proven man-killer that cannot be handled, let alone rode, nor bred, nor sold. I know horseflesh, none in this country better, and I say before God that grey stud is worth his hide and his hooves." He let the folded note fall open like a man spreading a winning hand. "Worth nothing, in short, and I take the whole sorry place in settlement only because the law leaves me no gentler road. The horse is worth more than the note, and you have known it longer than anybody in this room." It was not a loud voice, but it was a voice accustomed to being heard across a corral through wind, pitched low and carrying, and the hall went quiet around it, and heads turned along the rows the way grass turns under a gust, and Opal Sackett came down the aisle with her chin level and her mended gloves folded in her hand, out of the crowd of townfolk where she had stood unnoticed, a little woman in black that half of them knew only as the Ashfords' temporary kitchen help, and Mrs. Teague said, quite audibly, "Well, I never." "And who," said Draper, smiling his skim-milk smile, "might you be?" "Opal Sackett, widow of Cole Sackett of the Wind River Sacketts. My husband broke rough stock for the remount trade in 3 territories. His father took the rough string wages at every outfit on the Sweetwater for 30 years. I was 15 years in the corral beside him, and I will let any man here who ever bought a Sackett-gentled horse stand up and say what that name is worth. A silence, and then, halfway back, an old brush popper from the mussel shell got slowly to his feet with his hat over his heart and said, "It's worth exactly what she says it is, Judge," and sat back down, and the hall began to hum like a hive. Opal turned back to Draper. "You say the Grey is a man-killer worth his hide. I say he's a sound son of Meridian, worth 10 of that note, made outlaw by your own hired man with a bottle and a gouging iron so you could steal him inside a foreclosure. Now that's my word against your word, and I know what my word weighs in this town, coming from kitchen help." She let that sit one beat, and then she raised her voice just enough to reach the last row. "So, we won't weigh words. The corral by the livery is 30 steps from that door. Put the Grey in it, here, now, before every soul in this county, and I'll ride him. If he kills me, you were honest, and you can have the hide you prize so dear. And if I break him, in public, where 12 men failed, then every man and woman in Cedar Bend will know exactly what he's worth, and exactly what your sworn word is worth, and we can go on to the matter of the paper in your hand. You say you know horseflesh. None better." She smiled for the first time, and it was Cole's smile, the one he wore going into a bad corral. Prove it. There was no way out of it for him, and his face knew it before his mouth did, and the whole town poured out of that hall like water out of a kicked bucket. They ran the Grey from his pen into the livery corral, and he came in fighting, ugly with fear, and the crowd packed the rails 6 deep and made the low sound crowds make when they expect to see blood. Josiah pushed to the front with Wren on his arm, and his heart going like a hammer, and he would have called it off, was drawing the breath to call it off, when Gus Pell's ruined hand closed on his shoulder. "Leave her be," the old man said, in a voice Josiah had never heard him use. "I've watched her cross a yard for a month, and I'm an old fool that wouldn't see it. That's no kitchen help, Josiah. That's a horsewoman, maybe the last one. Leave her be." Opal came through the poles alone and dropped the bar behind her. She stood easy in the trampled centre with the riata coiled soft in her left hand, and she began to talk, that low-level, endless nothing talk, and the crowd, not knowing why, fell silent to hear it. The Grey ran his circles around her, blowing, rolling his eye white. She turned on her heel, slow, always facing his shoulder, never his eye, a small black pivot in all that motion, talking, talking. Minutes went by. In the crowd nobody breathed. The Stallion's circles wore down smaller. His tail came down. His ear, the near one, bent to her and stayed bent, swiveled to that voice like a compass needle finding north. And the town of Cedar Bend watched a thing that not one of them could have named, which was a frightened animal listening, for the first time in a long season, to the one human sound that had never once lied to him, the voice from the cold mornings at the fence, the oats, the flat, warm palm. He stopped. He stood off her right shoulder, quarters shifted, blowing hard, and she did not move toward him. She moved away. 2 slow steps, giving him her back, which brought a moan out of Gus Pell like a man watching a church burn, and the Grey did what a horse who has decided will always do, what horses have done since the first cold fence in the first cold morning of the world. He followed her. The saddling took the better part of an hour, and she never hurried 1 second of it. Blanket shown and rubbed and eased on, rigging let down soft, cinch taken up a breath at a time with long waiting between, and the crowd stood the whole hour in the north wind, and no one left, and no one spoke. And when at last Opal Sackett gathered the rein and the mane and stepped up into the stirrup and swung her leg over and sat down in the saddle light, as a sparrow settling, the grey son of Meridian bowed his neck and trembled once all over like a poplar in wind and did not buck. She squeezed him forward, and he walked. She lifted the rein and he trotted, floating over the frozen ground with his tail up like a banner, and she brought him around the corral both ways and stopped him square in front of the rails where Roland Draper stood, and the town of Cedar Bend came apart. Hats went in the air. Men who had bet against her pounded strangers on the back. Mrs. Teague was weeping, entirely without knowing it. And up on the rail, Toby Ashford was screaming himself hoarse, and beside him Nell stood with both hands pressed to her mouth and tears cutting down her face, whispering to nobody, to herself, to a grave up the hill under a wind-bent pine. I didn't believe a woman could. I didn't believe anybody could. Opal sat the gentled Stallion and looked down at Draper, and the corral fell quiet to hear her. "His hide and his hooves," she said. "Your sworn appraisal before the judge and this county. Either you're the poorest judge of horseflesh between the rivers, Mr. Draper, or you knew what he was and lied under oath to steal him." She drew the brown bottle from her coat and held it up, turning it so the low sun caught the glass, and told them in a corral-carrying voice, all of it, the path from the line camp, the dosing and the gouging, week upon week, from the ice out of spring through the summer and the fall. Loomis's sworn statement, 4 days old, sitting in the sheriff's drawer, and the note, the neat, fresh note in Draper's coat, written on Chicago paper, Loomis himself had freighted from the railhead in June, 2 months after the signing, to replace a true note shook on for spring and burned in an office stove. "The sheriff's had it all these 4 days," she said. "I expect he was waiting, same as me, to see you swear to that paper in open court. You swore to it in that hall today, with the whole county for witness." Draper broke for the livery archway and got exactly 11 steps, which was where the old brush popper from the mussel shell happened to put out one bowed leg, and then the sheriff had him, and the crowd's laughter as he was hauled up the street with his grey gloves in the mud was the end of him in that country, as sure as any sentence the territory handed down later, which it did. The judge tore the forged note in half on the courthouse steps for the pleasure of the crowd, and a stockman up from Cheyenne for the court day pushed through to Josiah's elbow before the wagons had even cleared, asking after stud fees for the Meridian Grey, spring bookings, cash money, and named a figure for the first season alone that was more than the whole of the debt had been. And Josiah Ashford stood in the street holding his youngest daughter and did arithmetic in his head for a moment, and then, for the first time in the 2 years since he had buried his wife, he laughed out loud. The morning after, the Lazy H woke up a different outfit, though the buildings had not moved. The grey Cinder, the children had named him by unanimous vote at supper, stood in the far corral in the early light, with his hip cocked and his lower lip loose, watching the kitchen window, waiting on a voice. The gouge wounds under his jaw were dressed with salve and healing clean. At the breakfast table, into a lull in the clatter, Wren set down her spoon and announced, with the terrible carrying clarity of the 4-year-old, "Opal broke the grey and Opal is stayin'," and went back to her porridge as one stating settled law, and nobody at that table corrected her, and Toby grinned down into his plate until his ears went red, and Nell got up quickly to fetch more biscuits that nobody had asked for, keeping her face to the stove a good long minute. Gus Pell was waiting in the yard when Opal came out. The old man stood by the far corral with his hat in his 2 hands, working the brim around and around, and when she came near he did not make a speech, being constitutionally unable, but he reached over and swung the corral gate open, wide open, and stood holding it for her, and said, looking off at the mountains, "Got them 3-year-olds ought to be started before the snow." And that was all he ever said about any of it, but from that morning the corral was hers, and he worked the young stock at her stirrup like a man 30 years younger, and did what she said before she said it, and along toward Christmas she overheard him at the Mercantile telling the postmaster, at length, and with immense proprietary satisfaction, exactly how his outfit's horsewoman had roped Draper's man in the dark, with 50 feet of rawhide, his outfit, mind, his horsewoman, and she bought her thread and slipped out smiling and never let on she had heard. Nell came to her at the week's end. Opal was at the corral fence in the blue evening, and the girl came across the yard slow with her shawl clutched and stood beside her a while watching Cinder work his hay, and finally said, in a small voice with all the fences down at last, "I told Wren not to love you. I told all of them. I thought, everybody that's fit to love goes. That's what I thought," Ma went. "And I thought, if I," and there she stuck, and Opal did not embarrass her by finishing it, nor by forgiving out loud what needed no saying, because there are things you do not walk at directly. Instead, she reached down and picked up the coiled, soft rope that leaned against the post, and put it in the girl's hands, and turned her by the shoulder to face the corral. "A horse tells you everything, if you know how to listen," she said. "Look at his near ear. That ear is a weather vane, and it's pointed at you right now. Did you know that? He's been reading you since you crossed the yard. Now shake out a loop like this, no. Let your wrist be lazy there." And in the falling dark, she taught Della Ashford's eldest daughter to throw her first clean loop over a snubbing post. And when it settled true, the girl laughed, high and surprised, a girl's laugh, one that had not been let out in years. And from the porch Josiah heard it, and had to turn and look at the mountains a while himself. He came out to the corral at dusk on a Sunday, some days after, when the children were in and the lamps were lit behind him, and the first real snow was making up in the north, grey and soft over the peaks. Opal was up on the top rail in her barn coat, watching Cinder move through the blue shadow, and Josiah came and stood by the fence with his hands in his pockets, and for a while neither of them said anything, which was their way, and the way of that country. He had rehearsed things. He had been rehearsing them for days, wages and land shares and the schooling of the children, terms, propositions, sensible arrangements a man could offer without his voice betraying him. He looked up at her small dark shape against the last light, this woman who had stepped off a coach with one carpetbag and put his world back on its feet, who had given his son a trade and his eldest her girlhood back and his youngest a shoulder to sleep on, who had gone into the dark alone with a coiled rope to save a place that was not hers, and every rehearsed word left him at once, the way birds leave a field, and what came out was one word, plain, worn smooth, offered up like a hand. Stay. Opal watched the grey a moment longer. The snowlight lay along the corral poles, and up the hill the wind moved in the bent pine, easy now, and somewhere behind her in the lit house a child was laughing over supper. Not as his kitchen help, she knew that. He was not a man who could say the rest of it yet, no more than she was a woman who needed it said before its season. It would get said, in the spring, in its time, before a preacher in Cedar Bend with 7 children in one scrubbed row, and old Gus Pell weeping shamelessly into his good bandana. There was no hurry. She had learned everything she knew from horses, and the first thing horses teach you is that the sure way and the slow way are the same road. "I'm already staying," she said. He nodded once, and stood beside her fence a while in the falling dark, and then went in to see about the children, and if his step on the porch boards was lighter than it had been in 2 years, nobody was there to remark on it but her, and she was not telling. She stayed out a little longer by lantern light in the first loose flakes of the snow. There was a young colt in the near pen, a leggy sorrel yearling out of the old bay mare, and she went into him easy and stood at his shoulder in the yellow ring of light, rubbing him down with a sack, letting him mouth her sleeve and learn her, talking the low nothing talk while the snow came down soft on the pole fence and the barn roof and the long dark land. Cole used to say that a horse can't be broke to be worth anything. Not truly. That the word itself was a lie the loud men told. "You don't break anything," he used to say, with his hands moving gentle on some trembling wild thing. "You just keep showing up at the fence, cold morning after cold morning, until the day the scared creature looks up and figures out that it's home." The colt sighed and leaned into her hands and stood. Behind her the house settled, warm and full, its windows laying gold down the yard, and Opal Sackett worked on in the hush of the falling snow, unhurried, in the one place on this earth she was ever going to be again, and knew it the way the grey had come to know her voice at the fence. Not permitted, not hired, built, morning by cold morning, and hers, and home.